Hello, welcome. This is a history of modern philosophy, and I'm Mark Thorsby. In this video series, we are discussing a range of modern philosophers from Descartes to Nietzsche. Today, we'll be looking at David Hume. I encourage you to follow along. This is the book we're using, so this is where the page numbers are related to. But please follow along, and of course, you can pretty much get, well, you can get all of these texts freely available online, so I encourage you to follow along. Let me start off with the recap here. We've looked at a number of different philosophers so far in this video series, or in the lectures. First, we started with the discussion of Descartes. Descartes is considered the father of modern philosophy. And here, Descartes was important because he introduced to us the notion, or rather, he introduces to modern philosophy the idea that epistemology is the primary field in philosophy, because ultimately, we can't know about the world. We can't know how the world, we can't have knowledge about the world unless we already have a worked out sense of what it means for us to know something to begin with. That is, how is knowledge possible? Now, metaphysics and epistemology are integrally related, particularly in Descartes. But what we should say here is that Descartes' dualism, right, ultimately begins with this radical doubt. If we doubt all things that can be doubted, then what can be known from there, right? And in the second principal contribution that Descartes makes is the notion that knowledge must begin with the subject, the cogito. And we get the notion that Descartes' notion, I think, therefore I am, must necessarily be true whenever it's spoken or thought, right? This insight is absolutely critical for Descartes. Because it's from there that we have to build a bridge to knowledge of the world. And this leads Descartes to bifurcate the mind from the world. And we get what later we'll talk about is very important, is a subject-object split, where it looks like they're epistemologically inaccessible of each other. But anyway, so we get this notion of Descartes. And then from Descartes, we looked at the rational school of philosophers, or at least looked at some of them. We took a look at Leibniz, who argues for a rational monadology. He argued that this is the best of all possible worlds because God is infinite and God's all-powerful, and therefore since God's good, and God can only do that which is good, and we're the product of God's existence, it follows that this is the best of all possible worlds, which seemed like an absurd conclusion morally, but one that's quite rational, you'll notice. And central to this notion for Leibniz is the concept of the infinite, and he articulates a monadology where every substance is metaphysically distinct from everything else, and nothing can have direct interaction. And this was even related to, if you'll recall in the lecture that I gave, that this is even related to his notion of logic and what it means in language to predicate something of something else, right? Remember, Leibniz's idea was that if I say this is a heavy glass of water, that ultimately the predication there has to be included within the subject in order for its comprehensibility and all of these sorts of reasons. And so this led Leibniz through his sense of, through his analysis of reasoning and of the infinite, it ultimately leads him to a monadology in which God gives us a pre-established harmony, which organizes everything. Now Spinoza also offers a meditation on the infinite, but in his view, the infinite ultimately has to be monistic, which means that there is no distinction of substances. There can only be one real substance, and that's God, and that we, as beings, are effectively modes of that substance. And so this leads to a sort of pantheistic conclusion in Spinoza. And then with Pascal, I put him on here. We only looked at Pascal's wager, so to be fair, we haven't actually address Pascal in his own right. Maybe that's not fair, but for sake of time, we have to pick and choose. But with Pascal, I think we see that even in his wager in particular, that even when we don't have certain knowledge of something, we can still have rational belief. And so in the wager, you see an argument for why it's rational to believe God exists, even though because God is an infinite being, you can't ever conceptualize it, ultimately. So if you can't conceptualize it, how do you know when you have it? And it doesn't even make sense for a finite mind to intuit an infinite concept. It doesn't even follow. So with Pascal, we have this notion of rational belief in spite of, if you will. So this is sort of some of the rationalist camp that we've taken a look at. And notice that it all has to do with this conception of the infinite and infinity. And with Descartes, remember, the infinite is one of these innate ideas that reveals the fact that for Descartes that there must therefore be an infinite being that placed that notion in me. So the infinite perfection of God for Descartes is this central innate idea. Now with Locke, we see a completely different branch of philosophy developing. With Locke, we see first and foremost a rejection of the notion of innate ideas and the notion that God is an innate idea in particular. And instead a very different epistemology. Now, where Locke has agreed with Descartes is Locke agrees that A, it is a worthy project to figure out what can be known. Number two, he thinks we can, in fact, do this. So this is not only a noteworthy project, but it's a project that we can actually make progress on. He just thinks Descartes goes in the wrong direction. Instead, we have to think of the mind as a blank slate upon which experience writes itself. And so for Locke, he says that we have a range of different ideas, but all of our ideas are first and foremost subjective. So we never, in Locke's view, have direct access to the objects we're experiencing them. Even when I touch my glass, even though only have the experience of touching it, how do I know what is actually happening outside of that experience? Well, you can see it's a nonsensical question, because in principle, you could never know. And that's essentially Locke's view here, which means that when we have our experiences of the world, knowledge consists in the agreement of those ideas of the world. It doesn't consist in us determining or verifying the material or substantial nature of a thing. It rather consists in the agreement of ideas. And so Locke's philosophy, his empiricism, says let's look at the categories by which experience is made manifest in our experience of the world, and talk about the limitations of those things. So for instance, we see a distinction between primary and secondary qualities, where a primary quality for Locke is a quality that must adhere because it's essential to the object itself, hence it's primary. So for instance, like the solidity of the cup is the example I always give. Because if the cup wasn't solid, it wouldn't be a cup, right? Imagine if I tried to pick up the cup and I picked up, and it was just vapors, right? Or it was a hologram, right? And they would no longer be a cup in my sense of the term cup. So solidity must be a quality that's given in our perception, an idea that must be essential. It must actually tell us about the cup itself, even though we don't have that direct access. A secondary quality would be those qualities that are actually related to my own subjective awareness of the thing. So for instance, the color of the highlighter. So the highlighter is an orangish color, right? But the idea here is that color is not something that there has to be agreement on, actually, right? So whether or not I'm seeing the correct color of this doesn't seem to change, or the color I do see, it doesn't seem to change what it is, because in color science, we know that orange is not actually in the object. Orange is a consequence of the refraction of light upon the object, right? So this means that color is, think of color and taste and things like this. Notice that the secondary qualities, you can't have objective agreement on color, for instance. And I know that you can measure light waves, but that's really the agreement regarding the measurement of light waves, not the agreement of my experience of color. And because of the primacy of subjectivity that begins with Descartes, we have to address the problem from the side of perception. We can't, as it were, assume the way color science does that there are material properties in the world that act in such and such a way. I'm getting off track, right? So we get this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. And Locke also says, though, that the matter of something, what it is never given to us, though. We only have the 5 modes of sensation. He says maybe even more are possible. In fact, new technological science seems to indicate that new forms of perception are possible. But we'll talk about that later. Or email me or something. And so we get this notion that means that no matter what, we don't really know outside of these sensations that there really is anything there, but we assume it is. And this brings us to George Berkeley, who says that, well, wait a second, you can't just assume it anyway. What you have to say is you have to say, what do we know? We know that we have access to ideas, and we know that when we have perception, we attribute the existence of something. And so Berkeley postulates the principle that esse est percipi, right? Or to be is to be perceived, and that's sufficient, right? We don't perceive matter, so therefore we should not say that matter exists, right? In the same way that if you look right now in whatever room you're at, and this would be crazy if it's different, but if you look in your room and you see a pink clown, right? Then you would say that that clown is existing in your room. But if you're looking right now and you don't see it, then you don't think it exists, right? So if someone asked you after watching the video, it's like, does a pink clown exist in your room? I don't know why someone would ask that, but if someone asked that, right, what you would have to say is, no, it doesn't exist. And your insistence that it doesn't exist would depend upon your perception of it, right? And so Berkeley's notion is, well, once we take that seriously, then that means that the distinction between primary and secondary qualities doesn't make sense anymore, because what I'm experiencing is the cup, the idea of the cup, and I'm not experiencing a secondary quality of the cup, which he doesn't think actually is even comprehensible. And so this initiates for Berkeley a form of idealism, right? And there's more we could talk about then, but I'll keep going here. The other philosopher I put off to the side here is Thomas Hobbes, who's really important because Thomas Hobbes, there is a relationship, but I don't think that Thomas Hobbes' writing is related directly to Descartes' meditations in the way that we see the rest of these philosophers falling under Descartes. That's because Hobbes is a contemporary, but I think what you do see is that Hobbes is concerned about the same sorts of things. At least you see in Hobbes a sense that we have to be able to give a rational explanation for why our government is organized the way it is and what justice really means. And so you see a type of empiricism, rationalism, and materialism in Hobbes that's quite modern, and I think quite prevalent actually in contemporary society. So here's a sort of thinking map, if you will, of the same thing. You see sort of rationalism, empiricism, idealism, logic, rational belief, monism, social contract. But you can see here, today we're going to be talking about what David Hume offers us is another consequence that follows out of the British empiricist camp, and that is mitigated skepticism. We're going to see here that ultimately David Hume's going to argue that knowledge is possible, but a lot of what you think you know, you don't really know, which means that if you will, David Hume sort of comes and cuts the hedges back on how much we think we actually know. Knowledge is possible, knowledge comes from experience, but there's a lot more to the equation. Now, this is, by the way, this is the statue of David Hume in downtown Edinburgh, just down the street from the castle, and actually also the Parliament. So if you ever get a chance to go, yeah, he looks really nice and Romanesque here. Here's actually what David Hume looks like, or looked like. He lived from 1711 to 1776. He was from Edinburgh, Scotland, which today is the capital of Scotland, where you can visit, hopefully, if you ever go there, the Parliament of Scotland. David Hume is actually quite influential there. There's in fact a whole trail just across the street from his gravesite, named after him, called, I believe it's called Hume's Walk. So you can see he was a fairly rotund man, and he actually struggled with his weight a little bit. And he actually was given to great bouts of depression, probably related to it. Now, he was actually schooled at home until he attended the University of Edinburgh. When he first attended, he was going to go into law, and I believe that's what his family wanted him to do, but he turned to philosophy. And he actually at a quite young age, he offered a set of philosophical ideas that were just quite revolutionary, but no one really knew it until much later. But later on in his later life, he turned to history, and he actually wrote what's still considered the most important history of England, and it's called The History of England, 1762. So he literally wrote the book on the history of England. It's very, very long. I have not read it. So he was actually well known later in his life for the history of England, and probably most famous for that up until now, right? Up until a couple, maybe 100 years ago. Um, in his lifetime, he was famous for the history, but today he's really known in terms of his philosophy. Now, he wrote the Treatise on Human Nature in 1739. You can do the calculations here. He was quite young when he did it, so there's hope for all of us. But you can do something when you're young. So he's an enormous genius in this regard. But he wrote it in 1739 as a young man, and he actually wrote much of it while lodging at Le Fèche, which was Descartes' prep school, which is sort of an interesting touchstone in history. Very famous place. Certainly, he knew Descartes was from there. So he goes to Le Fèche and he works on this. After he publishes it, I forgot the exact numbers of the publication, but it basically didn't sell. No one knew about it. No one cared. It's a sort of I think he called it his stillborn publication. It was dead on arrival, essentially, unfortunately. And there's a lot more to say about this, and I encourage you, if you're interested in David Hume and you want to do your research papers on Hume, I encourage you to take a look at his relationship to the Scottish common sense movement within the history of philosophy. So Hume is responding to a whole range of people, particularly. So there's a sort of interesting relationship there. Now, he revised the treatise he then revised the treatise as an Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding in 1748. He actually split the Treatise on Human Nature into two different books. But that's the book we're going to be taking a look at today, the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which is much more readable, but I find the treatise to be much more precise. So I'm not sure what most people think, but it's a great text for us to start and take a look at. I did want to mention, of course, there's a famous or infamous collaboration with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In fact, the painting you see here is actually located, I believe, at the Portrait Gallery, the Scottish Portrait Gallery, I believe is the name of the museum. But right next to it is a painting of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau looks quite sinister, actually, in the painting. But there was a time that Rousseau actually came from France and spent some time with David Hume. David Hume, I believe, put him up in Edinburgh. And while he was there, he had the painting. But unfortunately, their collaboration sort of deteriorated. And Rousseau was paranoid. And he thought that the painting, that he looked bad in the painting because David Hume was trying to ruin his reputation. And he was upset. And what it shows is that oftentimes two geniuses will collaborate, but they don't always work together well. So sort of interesting sort of note on history there. Anyway, none of that matters. What we really want to get to today is actually laying out his contribution in epistemology. The other work I didn't mention is the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which you notice here, it was published in 1779, 3 years after Hume's death. But he wrote it much earlier, but he didn't publish it because he believed that it wouldn't be received well, which I think he's absolutely right, at least in his time period. It's a full-on attack. The dialogues are against the notion of religion, and he actually has even an argument related to miracles. And we'll talk a little bit about that today if we get a chance. Okay, let's sort of start off here. What I've done here is I'm just following through the text. If you have the text, I'm going to be covering really roughly pages 721 up into the 750s, and I'll talk about the rest at the end a little bit, but shorter. So the first sort of question is on section 1, and by the way, the first few pages of this text are written quite beautifully. Hume is actually an amazing author. Some of you may have had trouble reading it, but I think the key is to read it slowly. But he's a beautiful writer. But the first sort of question here is about the different types of philosophy that there are. Now, one of the people that Hume has his sights on the most are the medieval philosophers in particular. And he's thinking of the schoolmen, as they're often referred to. These would be the philosophers who are related to the philosophies of Thomas Aquinas, for instance, particularly, or other schoolmen who are Aristotelians or Platonists, right? Sort of the classic philosophers. And he often refers to their philosophy as sophisticated. Of course, that's an insult in philosophy. If, as you know, the history of sophism is one which, in the classical world, would be an insult. I think there are philosophers today who consider themselves sophists, but he thinks there's a lot of sophistical reasoning that goes on, and so he's also attacking this medieval worldview. But he'll go on to attack other philosophers as well, and I think he's in particular thinking of a rationalist group of philosophers. But the first sort of thing to look at here is that if we're going to figure out different types of philosophy, we first have to have a sense of what it means to be a human being. And first off, so he sort of talks about man, right, human beings, and he says every human being has two parts to them. They have what looks to be the active part of them. That's the part that acts, that does things. This is the part of you that's related to the will. So for instance, maybe later on in this video, you'll hit pause, right? You will act. So you have an active being. In moral philosophy, which is actually what he begins with discussing, it really aims at understanding this action and how we can be virtuous as active beings. On the other hand, there's another part of human beings, which is, he doesn't quite say it this way, but it's close. Essentially, it's the notion of reasonable being. Right? We have the ability to reason and to reflect. So I almost want to put active being versus passive being here, but using reason is not a passive exercise either. So we have two parts of us. We can think, but we can also act. And it's this reasonable being that seems to be concerned with gaining knowledge, ultimately through principles. And this is really what philosophy is about. Philosophy is about how can we gain knowledge, and how can we understand the principles that undergird our knowledge. He does say that philosophers are liable to easy error. Let me read you this quote. He says, "It's easy for a profound philosopher to commit a mistake in his subtle reasonings, and one mistake is the necessary parent of another, while he pushes on his consequences and is not deterred from embracing any conclusion by its unusual appearance or its contradiction to popular opinion." Now, right, so I love that description because on the one hand, he recognizes that it's very easy for us to make a mistake in our reasoning, but that once we make a mistake and have a false premise, then our arguments will consequentially begin to erode and the mistake carries forward. So it's very easy to make a mistake, but notice that since we're also beings that have an active will, we push on. And that means that often leads us to argue, leads philosophers to argue and believe the most incredibly bizarre things, right? And in particular, I think though he doesn't say this directly, I think he would include, for instance, Spinoza's view that all of us, all things that exist are just modes of infinite substance, and that is God. I think that, for instance, this would be an example of one of these exotic philosophical errors. So now he doesn't talk about that. In particular, I think he's thinking of especially Aristotelian philosophy in particular. But there is a defense of philosophy here that he wants to make. And he gives a very passionate defense, I think, ultimately. So take a look at some of the things he says here. He says, "The only method of freeing learning at once from these abstruse questions is to inquire seriously into the nature of human understanding and show from an exact analysis of its powers and capabilities that it is by no means fitted for such a remote and abstruse subjects. We must admit to this fatigue in order to live at ease ever after." So I love that phrase because he's saying we must engage with these questions. They're very difficult, and it's going to be very easy because they're so abstruse to just want to move on. And they're very difficult, but here he's saying it's, even though there's fatigue involved with this philosophy, it's worth doing because if we can figure out what these central principles are, then we'll be able to know what the limits and the capabilities of knowledge are. And then from there, we'll be able to delimit and figure out what is credible from what's not credible. And he thinks, and this is a very serious philosophical concern. What's his hope? He says, "But may we not hope that philosophy, if cultivated with care and encouraged by the attention of the public, may carry its researches still farther and discover, at least in some degree, the secret springs and principles by which the human mind is actuated in its operations. Astronomers. Now, he goes on to talk about astronomers, but he gives astronomy as an example here, right? He says that astronomy has made great strides in terms of the development of itself as a science. And I think his idea here is philosophy too can make strides. But philosophy has to make strides by ultimately, because what is philosophy? Philosophy is about the articulation of principles. That's what philosophy is ultimately about. And he thinks that philosophy can make strides in terms of articulating what these principles are that can be known, but that philosophy first has to understand and first engage in a detailed analysis of its own methodology and develop a more, I guess, systematic evaluation of what's possible, what it's possible to be said before we can articulate what these principles are. And this requires us to articulate the meta-epistemological principles. Now, I put Hume's revolution here. He says, happy if we can continue the boundaries of the different species of philosophy of reconciling profound inquiry with clearness and truth with novelty. And still more happy if reasoning in the easy manner, we can undermine the foundations of an abstruse philosophy which seems to have hitherto served only as shelter to superstition and a cover to absurdity and error. Right? So Hume cites, and he knows, he understands that the consequence of the philosophy he's about to argue are ones which are profound, and they will irrevocably change the philosophical equation. And he thinks that previous philosophies operate as a sort of shelter for superstition. Now, I didn't talk about it here, but one of the big reasons that motivated Hume's work was he wanted to, quote, free his countrymen of the myth of Christianity, end quote. Right? Hume had this idea that he believed, and if you look at the history at the moment, it's hard not to think this, right? But he sort of looks at this landscape, and it looks like religion, there's religious violence everywhere. And people are acting for religious reasons rather than rational reasons. And so one of the things that Hume is against is the way in which we can allow superstition or our beliefs, our religious beliefs, guide us in our action rather than our reason. And this is absurd, and it leads to error and disaster. And so he thinks that philosophers are doing this. He would say, of course, the schoolmen, but even, for instance, I think he would include, for instance, Leibniz's discussion of God's existence here, right? Or I think he would even look at Pascal's wager, and he actually does take a look at that. But what is Pascal's wager an example of from Hume's perspective? It's an example of trying to create some sort of sophisticated operation of reasons to justify belief where it doesn't look like you really have justified belief, right? Especially if you take seriously the idea that to perceive, that to be is to be perceived, right? And Hume's not an idealist like Berkeley, but so he has a great hope of what's possible here. And this is sort of the mission of his philosophy, if you will. And let me take a drink here. So section 2 is when he gets into the nitty-gritty here. And what I want to do here is just try to explain and not follow through the detailed arguments he gives here, but sort of relate to you how he argues what the origin of ideas consists in, and what principle that we have to adhere to once we have a sense of those limits. Okay, so I put here that Hume has utilized the method of experiential description. I should say that that's my phrase. This is not how Hume refers to what he's doing. And I'm not even sure that other Humean philosophers or philosophers who study Hume would describe Hume in this way. But what I see with Hume is that he's sort of sitting in his room thinking about the multiplicity of ideas, perceptions, and sensations, and looking at the multiplicity of ideas that are given in reasoning, and through this rational process. And he's trying to get a sense of does it all begin from? So, and he says, first we can distinguish when we just observe our experience, and this is the experiential description part, is when we look at the mind, it looks like the mind has two types of fundamental things in it. The first are impressions, and the second are ideas. Now notice that John Locke also used the term ideas, but John Locke used the term ideas to talk about every idea, right? So every idea was always an idea, and he never really laid out if there were really different types of ideas in a concrete, clear way. We see David Hume is going to do this. So what is an impression and what's an idea? An impression is essentially the sense experience I have that comes from the world outside of me, right? So the impression is given according to the sense that I can passively receive ideas from the world. These ideas are really sensations, right? But these sensations give way to perceptions. And then perceptions seem to give way to specific abstract ideas. And so his view here is that first and foremost, we have to recognize that one class or category of ideas are really just what we should call impressions. Because it seems to be how the world impresses itself upon us, upon the mind, right? And he says that it also looks like there is distinction in terms of the complexities that are given in these impressions. So that when I look at, for instance, right now I'm looking at a window, you can't see it, but there's a curtain right there. And I can see a multitude of colors and of shapes being given to me. So there's a complexity to it. But this complexity ultimately has to be rooted in its most simple elements. So we can make a distinction between simple impressions and complex impressions. Simple impressions must be the necessary starting point. Because, and think about this, is that a simple impression ultimately would be any irreducible component of a complex impression, right? The best example is if you're looking here at the video screen, you see there's different colors. There's orange, there's white, there's blue, and so on and so forth. Well, the whiteness is a simple impression. It gets combined with a bunch of other impressions that organizes it into what we might call a complex impression. Now, his notion of the mind here thinks that impressions are really these things that are outward, whereas ideas we're going to see are inward, right? So ideas seem to be the sorts of ideas that I can recall. These are the things that my mind is able to generate. And ideas seem, for instance, to give you an example, later on Hume will say that our ideas are always open to manipulation by our imagination. So you can think here that if you just start reflecting on something, you have the will to change those ideas. So if I want, I can imagine a horse with 5 legs, right? Why can't I? Right? My imagination's open to those ideas. Now, you can see here that where do my ideas come from? Well, obviously, my ideas have to come first from my impressions, right? So you get simple impressions, complex impressions, but then from there you begin to develop simple ideas. Think of, for instance, the simple idea of a number, right? And then over time, or through a relationship with other ideas, ideas can develop into complexes. So you can get a complex idea too. So we see the same, it's a similar framework actually that Locke had. But here we have the distinction between impressions and ideas. Now, ideas appear to be inward, right? Whereas the impressions are outward. So 2 things quickly, right? Ideas, he says, resolve themselves into simple ideas that were copied from a precedent feeling or sentiment, right? So this is where our ideas come from. So when I have think about my complex idea of justice, right? Okay, so I have this big idea of justice, but that idea has other simpler ideas that are related to it. For instance, how would I explain what justice is? I might say, well, justice is when people treat each other fairly. You can see, well, fairly in people relating to each other or treatment, these sorts of things are other ideas. And it looks like you can have ideas that are hierarchically, or maybe not even hierarchically, but just organized into a sort of complexity, a complex framework. And you can resolve these ideas into their simple ideas, but these simple ideas, like the idea of a person, has to come from some previous sentiment or feeling. And when he says sentiment, think about the impressions, right? Think about your sensations there. So all of our ideas ultimately come from our impressions. And B, people who lack the requisite, or an argument he gives for this is that people who lack the requisite sense organ also lack the requisite idea. So for instance, to prove this, well, don't do this because it's rude, I think, but if you were talking to someone who's your friend and your friend was blind from birth, right, it would be interesting to ask them whether or not they have an idea of what the color blue is. And what you'll probably find, and Hume suggests you will find, is that they will be unable to articulate a clear sense of that idea. Now, clearly people who are blind know that there is such a thing as color, even though they don't experience it. So they'll have some sort of idea of it, but where did those ideas come from? And you'll see that when you lack the necessary sense organ, then you will therefore lack the impressions that are needed for those ideas. So how is it we can distinguish? Now, one of the problems is how is it that we can really distinguish the difference between an impression and an idea? So, for instance, you can imagine, even when I'm dreaming, those are all, I guess, ideas because they're in me, but I experience them the way I would as if they were outward, right? So when you're dreaming, that raises an interesting problem, I think. He doesn't talk about it, at least not in these passages. But you can see here, how exactly do you know the difference of them? Well, in the treatise, he says the answer is simple. It's vivacity. That is the outward impressions are stronger and they're more vivid, whereas the ideas seem to be more faint and weak. The other thing is you can see that with our impressions seem to be non-voluntary to a large measure. So for instance, when I'm looking right now at the chair, I can't force the chair to change how it looks to me, right? So there's a way in which my impressions resist alteration by my imagination. So I think that's the sense in which they're strong. They have vivacity because they feel more real. They're more vivid, certainly, than when I just close my eyes and just think of the idea of a chair, or even try to just imagine my memory of that very chair. It's not nearly as vivid as when I look at it. So these inward ideas are faint and weak, and then also they're subject to manipulation by the imagination. Okay. Oh, actually, there's a quote here for you. He says, the mind, quote, is really confined within very narrow limits, and that all this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than a faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by the sense and experience. So we have sensation, we have experiences, and our mind is just organizing it and augmenting it and manipulating all of those memories. And this is really what the mind does, actually. Now, a key principle gets announced here, and this is absolutely pivotal to really the whole book, and that is this principle that if an idea cannot be resolved into a simple impression, then it is spurious. In other words, it's nonsense, right? So if you have an idea of something that you can't trace back its component ideas to an impression, then that idea is it's just an idea, in the same way that the notion of a unicorn is an idea, right? Because not every idea admits of reality. So how can we differentiate those ideas which are related to the world as we can know it versus those ideas which are either mistakes of reasoning or those ideas which are abstractions which are false? How can we know the difference? The answer is through this fundamental principle that if you can't resolve the idea into a simple impression, then you have to reject it. Okay? So now, this isn't the end of the story, though, because the next question is, okay, so the mind does this work of compounding and putting together and all of this sort of thing and augmenting and diminishing our ideas in functioning. Well, how exactly does our mind relate ideas together? Because put aside the question of impressions, but if we just look at ideas, how is it that we can relate these ideas together? Well, he thinks there's three fundamental ways that you can sort of abstract out of all the different relations you can imagine. He thinks there's three ways in which they relate together. The first is what he calls the law of resemblance. That's how he refers. These are all called laws for the association of ideas in the treatise. but in the Inquiry, he just calls them the association of ideas. But resemblance is the first one. So he says, for instance, when you see a picture of something, the picture makes you think of your idea of the thing, right? And so and why is that? The answer is because this picture right now is a picture of the Eiffel Tower, right? And notice here that when you just look at the picture, there's nothing that says Eiffel Tower. So where do you get that idea from, right? You probably know the Eiffel Tower is this huge monument in the middle of Paris, France. So you can see here the picture makes you think of the idea of the Eiffel Tower, and that's because the picture resembles the Eiffel Tower. Now, if you've never been to the Eiffel Tower, you're just trusting that the resemblance is there. But it is there. I've been there, and I've been right at this very spot. This isn't my picture, but I've been there right at this very spot. So the resemblance, so you have an association of idea through resemblance. The next is through the law of contiguity. Now, contiguity is a difficult term for a lot of people. Contiguity refers to the notion that something is next to or near to something else. And this would mean that this is both a conception, a relation in terms of both space and time. So for instance, he gives the example of an apartment. His example is a little odd, I think, but he gives the example of an apartment. He says that when you see an apartment or someone talks about an apartment, it would make sense for you to naturally relate your idea of the apartment to the idea of people engaging in discussion or conversation, because people do that when they're in apartments, and that's what we do. I do when I'm in an apartment or somewhere, a house or something. Another example here would be I like to think of it in terms of time and space. So, for instance, imagine that we go trick-or-treating. It's Halloween in the United States, and so, not today, but if it were Halloween in the United States and we went trick-or-treating together, you can imagine we're trick-or-treating and you ask me, where is your house on the block? And I say, my house is the one is next door to that one. And I point to a house and there's only one house next to it. You'll know which house it is, right? How? Because you're associating the ideas through contiguity. Another example would be, imagine if I say, you can do it in terms of time, right? I'd say, this video will be over in 1 hour, right? Now you can relate your idea of what you want to do after the video to a time. Why? Because you're relating to what's next to or near to something. Again, contiguity. The final law for the association of ideas is cause and effect. And cause and effect is the notion we also relate ideas together by thinking that one idea creates an effect on another idea. So we have a cause and effect relationship. So he gives the example, he says, for instance, if you have a wound, then I will think causally about the notion of pain. I will think you must be in pain because the wound is causing you pain, right? So we also relate our ideas together in terms of cause and effect relationships. So you've got resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. Now, these are the three laws for the association of ideas. And the way Hume describes it, I think he would say that there are maybe sort of sub-relations within each of these that we could talk about. But in general, this is the basic set of ideas. Now, to be clear, we're only talking about ideas. We're not right now talking about the world, or these things are called impressions, right? We're just talking about the way our ideas get related together. So just because there is resemblance, just because we associate an idea through resemblance, does not necessarily mean that the two things are resembled. Just because we think of an idea in terms of contiguity doesn't mean that they really are contiguous in the world. And just because we experience or we relate ideas together in terms of cause and effect relationships, like if I pour the water all over me, then that'll cause me to be wet. I can associate those ideas together, and so can you. But just because I can think those ideas doesn't necessarily mean that's what happens in the world. So this is a section related to the association of ideas, not the association of things, okay? Now, the next section here, he discusses skeptical doubts concerning the operations of understanding. And it requires something really important for him to get to next, which is he has to articulate a very important distinction regarding the objects of human reasoning. So there seems to be two categories for human reasoning. Now in the treatise, I think the way he describes this is a little bit different, whereas Hume describes this as being related to our language, right? He talks about that when we make statements or claims, it looks like we make two types of claims in language. We make, on the one hand, what we might call our matters of fact. So when I make a claim, let's start from there. When I make a claim that I'm holding a cup, right? That claim is related to an impression, right? We've already talked about that. But that claim is saying something about the world. So that claim is a matter of fact. Now, it's from matters of fact that our knowledge about the world derives, right? Because all knowledge comes through our experience. So that means that, but keep in mind here is that just because we have an impression of something, right? And I make a claim about that, Mark's holding the cup, that tells me about the world, but it doesn't tell me something that's absolutely necessary in the world, right? And I put here that matters of fact is an object of reasoning that lacks what we can call is absolute certainty, okay? So for instance, here's the way example I give it here is that the fact that I'm holding, is that when I say something, when I make a matter of fact claim, I say, I'm holding the cup or you're watching the video, I'm saying something that is probably true about the world, and it's something we can know happened in the world. Mark did hold a cup and you did watch a video. But it doesn't tell me something essentially necessary to the world. It's not necessary as such. It's merely a report about what's been experienced. So it lacks absolute certainty. So the best way to compare this is, because it could have been another way, right? So the example I sometimes give in class is, imagine that I'm giving a lecture in class and someone just gets mad, gets up, walks over and slaps me in the face and then walks out, right? That would be startling for me particularly. But if someone did that, right, there's nothing absolutely necessary that it had to happen, is there? Right? Because someone didn't have to, you don't have to get up and slap me in the face. So just because I learned something that happened in the world, I haven't learned something absolutely certain regarding the principles of the world, right? And it also looks like these matters of fact depend in large measure on a sense of cause and effect. So for instance, I'm thirsty, so I'm going to drink some water. And I can report that I have an experience, as a matter of fact, that there's an effect, which is I felt the water come down my throat, right? But so it looks like these matters of fact, they sort of lack this absolute certainty, and this will make better sense in a moment here. And they depend upon cause and effect, right? Maybe one thing I might say is, maybe the better way to explain what I mean by saying that matters of fact lack absolute certainty, what I would say is that we can distinguish two types of certainty. The first is contingent certainty, and the second is necessary certainty or absolute certainty. Contingent certainty is just being certain that something happened, but necessary certainty or absolute certainty is knowing that something must happen. And it looks like matters of fact only conform to the first part. So let's take a look at the next one here. We got, relations of ideas. Now, by contrast, matters of fact report what happens in the world. Relations of ideas actually are when we make claims or statements about how our ideas relate. Remember, ideas are these things that occur in the mind. Now, because their ideas just occur in the mind and they're open to my manipulation, that means that they don't give me knowledge about the world, right? So it doesn't give me knowledge about the world. Just because I'm thinking something doesn't tell me that it really is happening. So I can think, for instance, that Barack Obama is the president of the United States. He's no longer the president of the United States. So just because I'm thinking about it doesn't do anything. So ideas don't give us knowledge about the world, but ideas are capable of yielding this necessary or absolute certainty. So for instance, when I think about a triangle, right, when I think about a triangle having three sides, I can be absolutely certain about that because there's only one way that a triangle cannot be certain. So my idea in my head of a figure that connects together like this, right, I can be absolutely certain that that's representative of a triangle because I understand what the definition of the triangle is. In other words, I can relate my ideas in such a way that it becomes certain and there becomes a sort of necessary connection or a certainty between the relation of those two ideas or that complex of ideas. And so think about mathematics here, or think about the difference between mathematics and physics, right? Physics reports matters of fact, whereas mathematics reports relations of ideas, right? the mathematician can be absolutely certain that the Pythagorean theorem is correct, right? But that doesn't tell you about the world, right? By contrast, the physicist can report their contingent certainty regarding the results of an experiment, but that doesn't give them absolute certainty regarding the way the world is, because they're reporting a matter of fact. Now, to be clear, physicists use both matters of fact and relations of ideas. I'm just trying to give that as an example. And the other thing here is that relations of ideas do not depend upon cause and effect, right? So 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not the same type of relationship as, for instance, pour the glass on your lap and you'll get wet. They're very different in that regard, because there's something necessary to the one but not necessary to the other. Imagine, for instance, I poured the glass on my lap, but guess what? Maybe I have a cup right here that catches it, right? So in this sense, you can't always be certain of a matter of fact, but whenever you say 2 plus 2 equals 4, that will always be true and you can be certain of it. So you have these two objects of ideas that exist in the mind. Those which are related to matters of fact and those which are related to the world. And it's going to be really important for us to make sure that we clearly distinguish the two. And this brings up a major philosophical problem, which is namely, okay, it looks like our essential characteristic of matters of fact is this sense of cause and effect relationships. But the question is, how exactly do we gain knowledge of cause and effect? Where does our knowledge arrive from that cause and effect is a phenomena that's not just an idea in our head, that it's something that really is in the world? And he is going to give the example here of billiard balls, right? And he's going to go back to this example again and again. And it's a great example because imagine I have a picture here. Imagine you are playing a game of pool or billiards, and you hit one ball. You have the stick and you hit one ball, and then it hits a second ball, right? And you can ask yourself, in an obvious sense, in a commonplace sense, we would obviously say that the person who hits the first ball is the cause of the second ball moving. Or you should say, hitting the ball with the stick is what causes the second ball to move ultimately. And when you say that there's a causal relationship, what you mean is there's a necessary connection between hitting the first ball and the second ball also moving. So the question, though, is where exactly is this causal connection in billiards? You can see here, remember the principle that he articulates, that in order for something to be known, you have to be able to trace it to a simple impression. So you can atomize your experience. And sort of, if you will, take it frame by frame by frame. Imagine if you're looking at a movie reel of the ball being hit, of the billiard balls. And what you'll see in the movie frame is you'll see one event where the balls are in one position. You'll see another event where the balls are in a different position. Another one where they're in another position. And you'll see a multitude of positions. That, in other words, you'll see a multitude of impressions. But what you won't have is an impression of the necessary connection. Now, the necessary connection in relations of ideas is given because of the function and relationship of the ideas themselves. But when we're looking at the billiard ball example, we're looking at impressions. And these are ultimately impressions that we regard as matters of fact. But within those matters of fact, we don't actually have an impression of the necessary connection or the causal connection between the two. And there's related problems here to math and science, but I'm going to move on from there. Okay? Whoops. I think I skipped something. Let's go back here and find where we're going next. Okay? So, let's go here to the second part. That's where I'm missing it. So this raises the question, okay, what we need to do is we have to ask, what is the nature of all the reasonings concerning matters of fact? Hume thinks we've got to get clear on what the heck's going on with these matters of fact, in particular this causality business, because we clearly have an idea of causality, and part of it's because we just have this association of ideas. But the question is, is that actually represented by something in the world? Is causality itself a matter of fact? And he says what it is found asks what is the foundation of all of our reasonings and conclusions concerning this relation? And this requires that we take a look at our experience in detail. And he says what we're going to discover, though, is we're not going to find necessity, but what we're going to discover is a constant conjunction of events. What we're going to see is that we just become accustomed to seeing billiard balls move when you hit them with sticks. And then if we see this over and over, repetitiously, we begin to fill in the gaps, he thinks. And we begin to see a recognition that whenever this event occurs, that's a conjunction of events. And we start to think that, well, then, because this event occurs, it causes this event to occur. But he doesn't think that we actually have warrant enough to say that. In other words, he doesn't think that we can actually discover causal necessary relations as being matter of fact. Quote, all arguments from experience are founded on the similarity by which we're induced to expect effects that are similar to those which we have found to follow from such objects. Right? Think about for a moment, you're using a computer because you're watching this video, I assume, right? Now, you're accustomed to using a computer, right? You know that if you probably hit the space bar button, the video will pause. So if you want, do that right now. Hit your space bar. Okay, you hit your space bar, and you pause the video, and then you hit it again, and now I'm back, right? Okay, so you now think that you caused the video to pause. Why do you think that? Because you do it over and over. Imagine there's a person who's never seen a computer before. They've never seen a computer before. And imagine, for instance, they hit one button and they hit another, and then they hit the space bar and the video pauses, right? Isn't it unlikely that they will know that they have caused the video to be paused, or they will not understand how they caused it to be paused, right? Why? Because they've never experienced it before, right? There's no conjunction of events that's possible because it's the very first event itself. So this means that it's only through seeing things over and over that we begin to develop a sense that that our experiences are matter-of-factly related through a causal relationships. Hume's point is really going to be simple here, which is namely that cause and effect is ultimately something that occurs as an association of our ideas because of our mental psychology or whatever, but he doesn't think it's something real in the world. The only thing we can say, strictly speaking, because we have no simple impression of the causal necessary relation itself, because we don't have that simple impression, the best we can say is that there's a constant conjunction of events. Imagine here, what would it be like for aliens to come to imagine aliens just got here and they're using their telescopes or whatever to spy on you, and they're watching you do this video. And let's imagine you get up and you go flip the light off in your room. And then when you come back, you flip the light on again, right? Will the aliens automatically recognize that you are causing the light to turn on or off? They may not automatically recognize it. They may have no idea. For all they know, maybe you're turning the light on and off with your foot or with your words or something, right? It's only through seeing it over and over again that we begin to put the pieces together. And what that tells Hume is that it's the mind that's leaping to the conclusion of causality. It's not something that is actually given in our experience. Now, this is a major skeptical problem, and I hope you'll see why, because if Hume's right, what this means is that we should not and cannot say that we know that one thing can cause another. This means that science is on the chopping block. Material physical science, right? You've probably taken physics or chemistry previous to this. And if you know something about physics and science, right? Science fundamentally depends upon the presumption that there are causal relationships in the world, right? When a scientist does an experiment, the whole point is to see that if they do this and they do this differently, that by doing something differently compared to a control group or something, that they'll show a necessary connection of some other sort of outcome, right? So you put two chemicals together, nothing happens. You put one of those chemicals together with a different type of chemical, it explodes. You do it over and over, right? You're going to think that there's a necessary connection, but his argument here is that, strictly speaking, that cannot be said to be known. So this means that science itself is actually under threat, potentially. And to be clear, Hume is I think, acutely aware of this himself. In fact, in the treatise, you get passages where he describes the sort of despair and melancholy that comes out of these reflections. When you begin to take this seriously, it means that the field of your experience and what can be known in that experience is actually quite little. But you can see it also has the benefit of getting rid of all these bad philosophical ideas. So, okay, part one, what's the solution? How are we supposed to make sense of this? And I sort of have a number of different quotes to take you through some of what he discusses. Part one is, this passage, there is a step taken by the mind which is not supported by any argument or process in the understanding. Okay, so when our mind recognizes, or we have this idea that there's a causal relationship, we have to recognize that this is actually an operation of the mind, not an operation of the world. Which means that we can articulate or ask what principle is motivating the mind, right? And go back to the case study. Notice that when there's no experience, there's no connection, but where there's an experience, we relate the causal connection. So for instance, in mathematics, there's no causal connections, and there's no experience. So there's no connection there. But when we have the experience, that's where we seem to recognize this causal connection. So what's the principle? Well, the principle, he says, ultimately looks like it's just custom or habit. He says custom, then, is the great guide of human life. I'm not sure that's a good or a bad thing, but it seems to be a true thing, which is namely that the only answer seems to be that it looks like what organizes our recognition of causal connection is simply the habituality of our experience. It looks like we just become accustomed to it. So in other words, I think these balls are moving in causal ways because I'm habituated to the case that, well, balls always move like that when you hit them like that. But that's not to know a matter of fact. That's merely to apply through the will and through the imagination a sort of kind of superimposition on my ideas. So the conclusion here is, quote, all belief of matter of fact real existence is derived merely from some object present to the memory or senses and a customary conjunction between that and some other object. Or in other words, the mind is carried by custom to expect that heat or cold and to believe that such a quality does exist and will discover itself upon nearer approach. This belief is the necessary result of placing the mind in such circumstances. So it looks like what happens is the mind comes to expect things through the memory, and because of that expectation, we in this conjunction of events, which is customary, we begin to posit real existence to the idea of causality. And it looks like all of the belief that we think that matters of fact are real are also derived in this regard. So this is actually a quite startling conclusion, in fact. By the way, I was thinking about science when I was reading the quote there. Think about the fact that what do scientists do? What's the key thing in terms of actually gaining knowledge in an experiment? It's not that you gain knowledge once in an experiment. It's what? That you can repeat the experiment. In other words, if you can customize, in Hume's sense, the experiment into a constant conjunction of events, which you can anticipate, then this is when we say that there's a causal connection. And in fact, this is exactly what it looks like scientists do. They repeat each other's experiments, and when they can repeat them, they seem to argue that that must mean that those experiments are real. Or those experiments are actually telling us something about the real existence of something. Sorry, I keep moving this over. I'm having trouble controlling this thing. I want to go over here. For some reason, it didn't. Okay. Here we go. Sorry, let me talk about part 2 here. For some reason, the tracker wasn't working. Okay, so that's a major milestone. It means that the belief in matters of fact of their real existence is given precisely because of this customary habit. So that's a big feature. Now, what this means is there's a severe limit. Now, I don't have it in the notes here, but this means that for Hume, the reason is not guiding is not guiding the mind. It's the reverse. The mind is guiding reason. Because the mind is providing a superimposition and structure on those ideas through association and through the expectation of habit and experience and sentiment, right? But that doesn't tell us that there really is a causal connection in the world. Now, he says, quote, "The difference between fiction and belief lies in some sentiment or feeling which is annexed to the latter, not to the former, and which depends not on the will, nor can be commanded at pleasure," right? So let me say again, the difference between fiction and belief lies in some sentiment or feeling which is annexed, right, by the feeling, not the belief. And it depends not on the will, nor can it be commanded at pleasure. So there is a sense here in which we can differentiate our beliefs and our fictions based upon the vivacity of sentiment, it looks like. Now, there is a sense of where he argues for a sort of model of belief that I wanted to sort of lay out for you. It looks like that we have memory that combines with sense. So we have a sense impression, but we also have memories that resemble those sense impressions. And those seem to combine into an object, right? Into an object of something that's occurring. And then it looks like when this object is then appropriated by custom and imagination, and then combined with this sentiment, this feeling that is generated through a multiplicity of experiencing something over and over, that develops and builds into our beliefs. So you can say here that when we think that we're causing things to occur in the world, it's really a belief about the world we have that we're talking about. We're not actually talking about the world as such. And this is where he says, for instance, the imagination has reign over all the ideas. So the imagination can manipulate these ideas. And notice here that Hume's epistemology is not only helping decipher what the limits of what can be said, but his epistemology is also offering us a framework to understand how it's possible for people to believe in superstition and how it's possible for people to believe in things that are false. Because we do believe things that are false, right? And so he gives a sort of large then consideration regarding superstition, right? And the way in which superstition can come to be treated as something that's known and how these beliefs can build up in us. So imagine, for instance, I always give the example of rain dancing. Imagine there's a village somewhere, and the village, there's a drought, and what the village does is they hire a shaman or someone to come and to do a dance or perform a ritualist ceremony. And then immediately after the ceremony, that night, it starts raining. And let's imagine that every time there's a drought, this village calls in this rain dancer or this shaman to perform the ritual. And let's also imagine that every time the rain dancer does this, it rains. What will start to happen is quite clear. You will have created a constant conjunction of events. And because you've created a constant conjunction of events, what will occur is that you will start to expect it, and then because of custom and imagination, and because of the feeling and sentiment of the impressions themselves, this will organize itself into a belief that the shaman is causing the rain to fall, when this is clearly not the case. Now, you can talk about other types of superstition that would go along with this as well. But I like using this rain dancing example because, honestly, even if that happened to me, I teach philosophy, I teach David Hume, for goodness sakes, even if I was on an island and every time someone waved their wand, and it happened over and over after 1,000 times, I would start to think that, well, if you wave that wand, it's going to rain, right? We all do this. And so you can see here, this raises severe questions regarding science, because while obviously it gives us a framework to critique superstition, it looks like science falls within that critique as well. Now, one of the things he does mention is he also does make reference, I think, here to Leibniz when he begins to discuss the sense in which superstition can build itself up into a sort of pre-established harmony. So he actually relates that specifically. So I want to point your attention to that. I like the idea that because we're seeing these philosophers actually sort of attack each other now. And so I'm hoping that you'll start to take notice of that as you read through this. Number 6 is the principle of association, though, is not a product of the understanding, but a principle necessary for understanding. Perhaps it's a form of instinct or, quote, mechanical tendency. So this is really important because causality is rooted in the principle of association, but that isn't a principle that comes from understanding. It's a principle necessary for understanding, which means that we can talk about causality and we need it to try to understand things because that's one of the ways in which we associate our ideas together. But that doesn't mean that we actually understand that there is a necessary connection between events or a causal relationship between events. Okay, let's hope that my thing... Oh, man, I did real bad here. Let me go here. There's one more thing here I want to show you. He then sort of turns this question to probability, right? And notice here that now you can see that his epistemology is ultimately revealing for us really strict limits in terms of what can be said. And it looks like the causality is really amounts to a type of probability, right? And so he actually discusses this. I didn't want to talk too much about it, but I wanted to pull your attention to these two quotes. He says, quote, or to this one quote, "When we transfer the past to the future in order to determine the effect which will result, from any case, we transfer all the different events in the same proportion as they've appeared in the past and conceive one to have existed 100 times." So when we talk about the probability of something taking place, what we're really doing is we're just recalling the register of past conjunction of events we have. And then we're essentially extrapolating that out into the future, right? But notice here that the probability doesn't really tell you what the... Probability is just an inference looking forward. Probability doesn't tell you the actual chances of something happening, right? It's merely dependent upon an operation of the mind. Okay, I think we finally got out of all of those terrible slide paths I have. So my apologies for not getting that better organized. So what I have here, and I'm coming, because I know this video is running long, I'm coming here now to sort of final series of points that I want to talk about. And you can see all of it here is revolving around the idea of necessary connection. So the first point here is a passage from 743. He says, "Since external objects as they appear to the sense give us no idea of power or necessary connection, by their operation in particular instances, let us, whether this idea be derived from reflection on the operations of our mind and be copied from an internal impression." So there's the question again. If there's necessary connection, we have to look and see what the internal impression is that copies itself into the idea because of the principle that every idea has to be related to an impression, a simple impression ultimately. And you can see here that if you can relate an idea to a complex impression, of course you'll get to a simple impression. Now, here's the next point. The influence of the will is known through consciousness. So we can see here that the will does have an effect on our ideas, right? And the influence of the will is clearly known in consciousness because when we're conscious of the world, we're constantly utilizing or employing the will. So the notion of the will is an object of reflection based on our observation of our own consciousness. So that means that the will is something that we can say is a matter of fact because the will we can trace to this object that happens in reflection. And by observation of it, the will is something that's real. So we know we can have a will. At least we can know that it's a matter of fact. Now remember, since the will is a matter of fact, it therefore follows a range of different claims about it. Namely that the will is not subject to absolute certainty, and that the will seems to utilize a causal relation. That seems to be the case. When I will to pick up the cup, I do. So the will is an object of reflection, though. So we can talk about it. And it is something sensible that relates to the world. The next idea here is the motion of our bodies comes to our command of the will now consider the union between the soul and the body. Think about Descartes' relationship between the soul and the body and his dualism here. You can see here that Descartes thinks there's a necessary connection between our experience in reflection and the fact that we can move our bodies around. The question here is there a necessary connection? Do you have a simple idea of necessity here in terms of the will, in terms of the relation between the soul and the body? And it doesn't look like you do because, for instance, People who've lost their arm can will to raise their arm, but it doesn't happen, right? Or for instance, imagine if you give me some sort of medicine and I'm frozen, and I can try to will something, but it doesn't work, right? So where's the necessary connection between the will and the body exactly? Because not all movements of the body are consequences of the will, right? For instance, think about all of those things your body does. For instance, if you just stop and look at your body, you'll see your body's moving in and out as you breathe. You can stop yourself from breathing, but you can't like momentarily. But when you're not thinking about it, your body just starts doing it, right? And that doesn't seem to be a consequence of the will, because I'm not always thinking, oh, don't forget to breathe. What a nightmare that would be, right? So you can see here that anatomy tells us actually that the body moves because of muscles, not because of the will, right? So it looks like there's a clear problem regarding our knowledge of the will here. And you can see there's a critique of idealism that he offers that I think is applicable to both Leibniz and Berkeley, right? He says, if the balls don't move each other, then what some philosophers would argue and speculations would say was, well, it's not the balls that move each other, it must be God that moves them. And remember, Leibniz's notion is the pre-established harmony that God's moving, making the substances move according to each other, right? So it looks like Leibniz thinks God's doing it, and Berkeley thinks that God's doing that too because of his idealism. So you can see here, he thinks that some people will try to make sense of this by offering these other things. But the question is, okay, if you have a deity, then a Humean analysis would be, if you have a deity, you have an idea of a deity, in order to prove that that's the case, you would have to have ultimately a simple impression of the deity. And that's something by definition that cannot be given. Since it can't be given by definition, it's obvious to Hume that you have to reject the notion that the idea of God can have any sort of existence or reality. He says at one point, I just put the little quote in here, he says, we are got into fairyland. And he sort of gives this example that all these philosophers come up with the most wild conclusions and reasonings and arguments and exotic ideas in order to explain this stuff. It looks like what they're not willing to do is just recognize that we are actually left in a sort of profound ignorance regarding the idea of necessary connection. The answer is there is no simple impression that relates to the idea of necessary connection. And consequently, since there is no relationship, it's not something that we can say we can know. Which means that whenever we talk in philosophy about what can be known, or a philosopher is giving you ideas and they want you to believe they're true, you have to ask yourself, are they saying that there's a necessary relationship between things in the world? And if they are, they violated this fundamental empirical principle that knowledge has to actually come from your experience. Okay, so this leads finally to a skeptical conclusion. He writes, it appears that in a single instance of the operations of bodies, we can never, by our utmost scrutiny, discover anything but one event following another, without being able to comprehend any force of power by which the cause operates, or any connection between it and its supposed effects. So it doesn't look like no matter what the example is, or what type of experience I talk about, I can never find this cause and effect or necessary connection. So that means that, well, he says that when we say, therefore, that an object is connected with another, we may, or I should say may, not man, we may only that they have acquired a connection in our thought. So when we say that two objects are connected, we can only really say that they're connected in our thought. Let me give you an example of why this would be a skeptical conclusion. I'm thirsty. I feel refreshed. So I would say the water drink. And Hume's point here is, okay, good enough, but remember, when you say that the water caused you to feel refreshed, the connection there is only a connection in thought. It's a connection in your ideas. It's not a connection in terms of that water in your actual tongue, right? It's a connection that's made by the mind. So you can see here there's a revision here in terms of the limits that the mind is able to articulate, the limits for the articulation of the mind. So that means that, quote, no conclusion can be more agreeable to skepticism than such as make discoveries concerning the weaknesses and the narrow limits of human reasoning and that capacity. In other words, what David Hume does is he basically clips the wings of the philosopher. Now, he then goes on here to discuss a number of things, but we're running out of time, and so I'll just briefly mention these, but I'll leave them to you to read on your own. One thing he does discuss here is the question of liberty and necessity, and whether or not, and here today in modern philosophy, this is usually referred to as the problem of freedom versus determinism. But it's a real metaphysical concern, which is namely, okay, what about, we have this notion that the universe is determined according to natural laws. Well, first and foremost, the idea that the world is necessarily ordered is already something we can't agree to, because necessity is not something that is conferred through our impressions. So since it's not, it has to be rejected. So there's no necessary connection in the world to start with. The question though is, what about liberty? The idea that we're free to do things. But what we're going to see here is that even liberty, the idea that we're free, doesn't make sense either. Because the notion of being free means that there's a connection between the things we're doing. He writes, had not objects a regular conjunction with each other, we should never have entertained any notion of cause and effect. And this regular conjunction produces the inference of the understanding. And if the definition above mentioned is admitted, then liberty, when it's opposed to necessity, not to constraint, is the same thing with chance, which is universally allowed not to have existence. So you can see here is that ultimately he's going to deny both freedom and necessity, and that this means that this is going to subsequently reveal a denial of moral objectivity. Because the question of how I ought to live in the world depends upon all of these other things. In particular, and this is more my point, I think, or my reading than Hume's argument, is that the notion that we can live as moral beings requires the idea that we actually are free to do so. If we're not really free, that is, now clearly we have a sort of freedom of ideas, but the question of whether or not we're free in the world, this no longer makes sense, which means it really no longer makes sense to say that I should act in one way or another, because it's not something that can be really said. So this sort of leads to a denial of moral objectivity. Now, I'm not going to talk about it now, but if you're interested in it, take a look. There's a mistake there. I should say section 9. He also discusses the question of reason in animals. He denies that animals have reason. They clearly have some sort of rational operation, but they don't have the ability they put it this way. Animals have impressions, but they don't have ideas. And it looks like that's the big difference. And so he discusses that. He also discusses in section 10 his argument against miracles. I'm not going to go over that here just because we don't have enough time. But I think the way I might briefly summarize it would be to say that his argument against miracles is that miracles are by definition violations of the laws of nature. Where do we get a conception of our laws of nature? We get our conception of the laws of nature ultimately from this constant conjunction of events that occurs over and over and over again. Right? So the thing here is that a miracle is by definition something which cannot be a part of that constant conjunction of events. But if it can't be a part of that constant conjunction of events, that's exactly what we say is something that can't happen. They can't be necessarily related. But miracles are the affirmation precisely of that, which doesn't make sense. So ultimately, miracles for him are actually just incomprehensible. And of course, he has clearly in his sights here those who are superstition, in particular his religious neighbors who believe in miracles. In particular, he's thinking of Christians who believe in miracles. And he thinks that what Christians are doing, if I put words in Hume's mouth here, is that, and this is how I think Hume sees it, is that what Christians are doing is Christians have a belief, right? And for instance, maybe they have a belief that one of their elements for the reasons for the belief is that they have a prayer life, that when they pray something, good things happen, and so on and so forth. And that this seems to create a constant conjunction of events, so they believe it. And and everyone else believes it too, and everyone else agrees. So it all seems to work together. It looks like a sort of harmony of established beliefs. And so what he thinks happens is that we build these out, and then we begin to develop arguments. We believe in things that just don't even make sense anymore. Our reason really goes on holiday, if you will. And so then this, of course, raises the question of skeptical philosophy and the limits of skeptical philosophy. And then there's a range of concluding questions we could ask. But I'm not going to do that here because we've taken quite a bit of time. But I think what you can see here is that what we see in David Hume is really pushing in the most rigorous way the limits of Hume's insight that our knowledge comes from experience. But Hume's thought is, well, our experience doesn't tell us about a lot of things that we think we know. And a lot of the ideas we hold are really just imaginations of our own, or at least they are consequences of the mind, not products of the understanding. So that when the scientist says, for instance, that they understand there's cause and effect, they're making a mistake. And more importantly, of course, I should be clear, Hume's not against science, right? But his philosophy presents problems for science. But what Hume is against is philosophers, and philosophers who argue large, grandiose claims, like, for instance, that all things are merely modes of God's existence, and that, or for instance, in the case of Leibniz, that no object ever actually makes contact with another object because substance is totally separate, right? These things need to be rejected because ultimately they seem to be a consequence of going too far and not products of the understanding about the world. So this is Hume's epistemology, and of course there's lots more we could talk about his ethics and his religious discussions. He's a major philosopher, and if you're interested in learning more about Hume, I encourage you to actually read his treatise, which I think is more thorough than this. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you guys next time. I think we're going to be talking about Immanuel Kant's reaction to David Hume, but we'll see you guys next time online.